In the dimly lit chambers of Renaissance Florence, where shadows danced with candlelight and the scent of ink mingled with the weight of political intrigue, a truth was being born that would echo through centuries. Niccolò Machiavelli, exiled from power and stripped of his former glory, sat hunched over his desk, his weathered hands moving across parchment with the urgency of a man who had witnessed the brutal mechanics of human nature. He had seen princes rise and fall, watched armies crumble before superior strategy, and observed how the weak were devoured by the strong with the same inevitability as winter following autumn. But, in this moment of personal defeat, as he penned what would become his immortal legacy, Machiavelli discovered something profound. Adversity was not merely an obstacle to be overcome, but the very crucible that forged unbreakable men. The philosophy that emerged from his exile would challenge every comfortable notion about human nature, revealing that those who embrace their suffering and systematically destroy their weak selves become something far more dangerous than their enemies could ever anticipate. They become unstoppable. The streets of Florence bore witness to this truth daily. In the merchant quarters, men who had lost everything to political upheaval rebuilt their fortunes with a cunning that those born to comfort could never possess. They understood what Machiavelli was beginning to articulate, that adversity strips away illusions and reveals the raw machinery of survival. These men had learned to read the subtle signs of betrayal in a smile, to detect weakness in bravado, and to strike with precision when their enemies least expected it. Consider Marco Ventieri, a silk merchant whose family had served the Medici for generations. When political winds shifted and the family found themselves on the wrong side of a coup, Marco watched his father die in poverty, broken by the loss of status and wealth. But, where his father had clung to outdated notions of honor and loyalty, Marco embraced the harsh lessons of his downfall. He spent 2 years living among the city's poorest, learning their language, understanding their motivations, discovering the networks of information that flowed through taverns and brothels ignored by the nobility. When Marco finally emerged from this self-imposed exile, he was no longer the naive young man who had trusted in birthright and tradition. He had systematically dismantled every assumption about how the world operated, every belief that had made his family vulnerable. He began to rebuild his fortune not through the traditional channels of his class, but by understanding and exploiting the very forces that had destroyed him. Within 5 years, he controlled more of Florence's silk trade than the Medici had ever managed, not through inherited connections, but through a network built on mutual benefit and carefully calculated fear. This transformation embodied the first principle of Machiavellian adversity: the weak self must be identified and methodically destroyed. Marco's weak self had been the young man who believed that good intentions and noble birth would protect him from the world's cruelties. That version of himself had to die completely, not metaphorically, but with the same finality as his father's actual death. Only when he had murdered his own illusions could he begin the work of becoming unstoppable. The process of destroying one's weak self is neither quick nor painless. It requires the courage to examine every belief, every habit, every emotional attachment that might serve as a point of vulnerability. Machiavelli understood this from his own experience. His weak self had been the idealistic civil servant who believed that competence and loyalty would be rewarded, that justice would prevail over political expediency. The coup that stripped him of power had killed that version of himself as surely as an assassin's blade, but, unlike those who allow such defeats to embitter or paralyze them, Machiavelli performed an autopsy on his former self. He dissected his failures with surgical precision, identifying each point where sentiment had clouded judgment, where honor had prevented necessary action, where trust had made him vulnerable to betrayal. This was not self-recrimination, but strategic analysis. Every weakness catalogued became a strength in his reconstructed self. Every vulnerability eliminated became a weapon he could use against others who had not yet learned to kill their own weak selves. The streets beyond his window told the same story repeatedly. Adversity was the great teacher, but only for those willing to learn its lessons without flinching. In the poorest quarters of the city, he observed how those who accepted their circumstances with resignation remained trapped in cycles of poverty and exploitation. But among them moved others scarred by the same hardships but transformed by them, who understood that survival required the abandonment of every comfort, every moral luxury that the strong could afford but the weak could not. These survivors had learned what Machiavelli would later codify, that the man who destroys his weak self creates within himself an immunity to external destruction. When you have already identified and eliminated every point of weakness within yourself, when you have already experienced the worst that fortune can deliver and emerged from it stronger, what power do external enemies possess to harm you? They can take your wealth, but you have already proven you can rebuild it. They can damage your reputation, but you no longer depend on others' opinions for your sense of worth. They can threaten your life, but you have already died to everything that made the old you vulnerable. This philosophy stood in stark contrast to the prevailing wisdom of his time, which held that adversity was either a test from God or a random misfortune to be endured with patience and faith. Machiavelli saw such thinking as the luxury of those who had not yet been truly tested. Real adversity, the kind that strips away everything you thought you knew about yourself and the world, demanded a different response entirely. It demanded what he would later term virtue, not virtue in the Christian sense of moral goodness, but the ability to act decisively and effectively regardless of circumstances. The development of virtue required first the recognition that the comfortable self, the self that had been shaped by favorable circumstances and kind treatment, was fundamentally ill-equipped for a world where power determined outcomes and weakness invited exploitation. This comfortable self operated under assumptions that could prove fatal, that others would honor agreements, that institutions would protect the innocent, that merit would be rewarded and corruption punished. These assumptions, while perhaps true in isolated circumstances, represented dangerous vulnerabilities when circumstances turned hostile. In the workshops of Florence's artisan quarter, Machiavelli observed this principle in action. The master craftsmen who survived economic downturns and political upheavals were not necessarily the most talented, but those who had learned to adapt their methods to changing circumstances. When traditional patrons disappeared, they found new markets. When materials became scarce, they innovated alternatives. When competitors attempted to undercut them, they responded not with appeals to fairness but with superior strategy. Lorenzo the goldsmith exemplified this adaptive capability. When the political changes that destroyed many noble families also eliminated his traditional clientele, Lorenzo did not waste time lamenting the injustice or waiting for circumstances to improve. Instead, he studied the new power structures emerging in the city, identified who would be the wealthy of tomorrow, and positioned himself to serve their needs before they even recognized those needs themselves. More importantly, he had observed how his former wealthy clients had accumulated and lost their fortunes, learning from their mistakes and preparing for the inevitable cycles of political change. But Lorenzo's transformation went deeper than mere business adaptation. He had recognized that his former self, the craftsman who took pride in creating beautiful objects for appreciative customers, was vulnerable to any disruption in the supply of such customers. That version of himself had been dependent on external validation, on the continued existence of a particular social order, on the assumption that quality would always find its market. Each of these dependencies represented a potential point of failure. The new Lorenzo operated differently. He continued to create beautiful objects, but not because beauty was his primary motivation. He understood that beauty, quality, and craftsmanship were tools for achieving his true objective, the accumulation of power sufficient to protect him from the vicissitudes of fortune. His weak self had created art for its own sake, his transformed self created art as a means of control. This shift in motivation made him both more effective and less vulnerable to the kind of disruption that had destroyed so many of his peers. This process of systematic self-reconstruction extended beyond professional considerations to every aspect of personality and behavior. The weak self had formed attachments based on sentiment and habit rather than strategic value. It had made promises it couldn't keep and accepted obligations that served others' interests rather than its own. It had operated according to moral principles that, while perhaps admirable in abstract terms, created predictability that enemies could exploit. The reconstructed self, forged in adversity's fire, operated according to different principles entirely. Every relationship was evaluated in terms of mutual benefit and potential threat. Every commitment was weighed against its strategic value and the cost of maintaining it. Every action was chosen not because it felt right or satisfied some internal moral compass, but because it advanced objectives that had been carefully considered and ruthlessly prioritized. This did not necessarily make the transformed individual cruel or heartless, though it certainly made them dangerous to those who threatened their interests. Rather, it made them supremely practical in their approach to human relationships and social obligations. They understood that the greatest kindness they could show to those they genuinely cared about was to be strong enough to protect them, and that such strength required the abandonment of every weakness that enemies might exploit. The families that survived Florence's periodic political upheavals understood this principle instinctively. They did not preserve their wealth and influence through moral purity or passive endurance, but through careful attention to the shifting dynamics of power. When circumstances favored one approach, they pursued it wholeheartedly. When those circumstances changed, they adapted their methods without hesitation or regret. Their weak selves, the versions that had once believed in the permanence of any particular arrangement or the reliability of any particular ally, had been systematically eliminated and replaced with something far more resilient. Machiavelli recognized that this transformation required not just intellectual understanding but emotional and spiritual reconstruction. The comfortable self experienced fear, anger, and disappointment when events did not unfold as expected. These emotions, while natural, represented vulnerabilities that intelligent enemies would target. Fear could be used to manipulate decisions, anger could cloud judgment, and disappointment could create openings for those who offered false comfort or impossible promises. The process of emotional reconstruction began with the recognition that most emotional responses were based on assumptions about how the world should work rather than accurate assessments of how it actually worked. The comfortable self felt angry when betrayed because it had assumed loyalty was reciprocal. It felt disappointed when merit went unrewarded because it had assumed that competence guaranteed success. It felt fear when threatened because it had assumed that certain protections, law, custom, the goodwill of others, would remain reliable. Each of these emotional responses contained valuable information about the gap between expectation and reality, but only if that information could be extracted without being overwhelmed by the emotion itself. The transformed self learned to treat emotions as data rather than imperatives. Anger indicated that someone had acted contrary to expectations, useful information for updating models of their behavior, but not a reason to act precipitously. Fear indicated the presence of a threat that had not been adequately anticipated or prepared for, valuable intelligence for future planning, but not a justification for panic or paralysis. This emotional discipline required extensive practice and constant vigilance. The human nervous system had evolved to produce strong emotional responses to threats and opportunities, and these responses often demanded immediate action rather than careful consideration. Learning to interrupt this automatic process, to create space between stimulus and response, represented one of the most challenging aspects of self-transformation. Yet mastery of this skill provided extraordinary advantages. While others reacted predictably to provocation, the transformed individual could choose their response based on strategic considerations rather than emotional impulse. While others revealed their fears and desires through unguarded reactions, the transformed individual presented only what they chose to reveal. While others found their judgment clouded by strong feelings, the transformed individual maintained clarity regardless of circumstances. The merchants of Florence who survived multiple business cycles had developed this emotional discipline through necessity. They had learned that market panic created opportunities for those who could remain calm, that others' desperation could be leveraged by those who maintained their composure, that information flowed to those who appeared unaffected by its implications. Their success stemmed not from superior intelligence or resources, but from superior emotional control under pressure. This emotional transformation supported and reinforced the broader process of self-reconstruction. As individuals became less reactive to external circumstances, they became less dependent on those circumstances for their sense of stability and purpose. This independence, in turn, made them less vulnerable to manipulation and more capable of pursuing their objectives regardless of opposition or setbacks. The culmination of this first phase of development was the emergence of what Machiavelli would recognize as a fundamentally different type of person, one whose strength derived not from favorable circumstances or external support, but from the systematic elimination of internal weaknesses. Such individuals had learned to thrive in adversity not because they enjoyed suffering, but because they had discovered that adversity revealed and eliminated vulnerabilities that prosperity had hidden. The transformation was irreversible. Once someone had successfully destroyed their weak self and reconstructed themselves according to these principles, they could not return to their former state of comfortable vulnerability. They had crossed a threshold beyond which the old ways of thinking and being were no longer possible. This irreversibility was both a strength and a burden, a strength because it made them genuinely unstoppable by conventional means, and a burden because it separated them permanently from those who had not undergone similar transformation. As Machiavelli worked through these ideas in the solitude of his exile, he began to understand that he was documenting not just a philosophy of personal development, but a new form of human evolution. The comfortable self represented humanity as it had developed under favorable conditions, trusting, cooperative, dependent on social bonds and institutional protections. The transformed self represented humanity as it could become under pressure, autonomous, strategic, capable of thriving regardless of external circumstances. The question that remained was whether this transformation could be taught to others or whether it required the harsh teacher of personal adversity to be truly internalized. Could someone choose to destroy their weak self proactively, or did circumstances have to impose this destruction upon them? The answer would determine whether this philosophy represented merely an interesting observation about human resilience or a practical method for developing genuine strength in a dangerous world. Part 2, The Architecture of Invulnerability. The morning mist hung heavy over the Arno as Alessandro Borghi made his way through the narrow streets of Florence, his footsteps echoing off ancient stones that had witnessed centuries of ambition, betrayal, and reinvention. 5 years had passed since his family's banking empire had collapsed under the weight of political machinations and strategic miscalculations, 5 years since he had watched his father die of shame and his mother retreat into madness. But the man who walked these streets now bore little resemblance to the naive heir who had once believed that reputation and good intentions could shield him from the world's cruelties. Alessandro had spent these years constructing something unprecedented, a fortress not of stone and mortar, but of strategic thinking and systematic preparation that made him immune to the forces that had destroyed his family. He had learned to read the subtle language of power that flowed beneath Florence's civilized surface, to understand the mechanics of influence that determined who rose and who fell. More importantly, he had learned to construct his life in such a way that no single point of failure could bring him down, no individual betrayal could leave him vulnerable, no change in circumstances could catch him unprepared. This was the second principle of Machiavellian philosophy. Once the weak self had been identified and destroyed, the space it had occupied must be filled with something far more sophisticated, an architecture of invulnerability that anticipated every possible threat and prepared multiple responses to each. This was not paranoia, but practical engineering applied to human existence. Just as a master architect reinforced a building's foundations before adding stories, the transformed individual reinforced every aspect of their life before building toward their ultimate objectives. The process began with a comprehensive analysis of every way the old self had been vulnerable. Alessandro had spent months cataloging his father's mistakes, identifying each point where sentiment had overruled judgment, where trust had been misplaced, where single points of failure had been allowed to develop. His father had concentrated too much wealth in political relationships that could shift overnight. He had relied too heavily on the goodwill of clients who had their own pressures and priorities. He had operated according to traditions that assumed a stability that no longer existed in the rapidly changing world of Renaissance commerce. Each identified vulnerability became the foundation for a new strength. Where his father had relied on a few powerful political connections, Alessandro cultivated relationships across the entire spectrum of Florence's power structure. He maintained friendships with rising merchants who might challenge the established order, connections with foreign traders who operated outside local political constraints, and carefully managed relationships with representatives of competing political factions. No single political shift could isolate him completely, because he had ensured that he always had alternative sources of support and information. But this diversification extended far beyond political connections. Alessandro had observed that his father's business had failed not just because of political pressure, but because it had become dependent on a particular economic model that could not adapt to changing circumstances. The family bank had specialized in financing trade routes that became less profitable as new routes emerged, had focused on currencies that lost value as political boundaries shifted, had invested in industries that were displaced by technological innovation. The new Alessandro constructed his economic foundation differently. Rather than specializing in any particular sector or geographic region, he developed expertise in reading and anticipating change itself. He studied not just current profitable opportunities, but the underlying forces that created and destroyed such opportunities. He learned to identify emerging technologies before they became mainstream, to spot demographic shifts before they affected markets, to recognize political trends before they became obvious to his competitors. This ability to anticipate change provided two crucial advantages. First, he could position himself to benefit from transformations that caught others unprepared, and, second, he could avoid the trap of becoming too dependent on any particular set of circumstances. While his competitors focused on maximizing profits within existing frameworks, Alessandro focused on understanding and preparing for the frameworks that would replace them. The principle extended to every aspect of his personal and professional relationships. Where the old Alessandro had formed friendships based on shared interests and emotional compatibility, the new version evaluated every relationship in terms of strategic value and potential risk. This did not make him cold or calculating in his personal interactions. Indeed, he had learned that genuine warmth and interest in others often served his purposes better than obvious manipulation, but it meant that he never allowed sentiment to override strategic considerations. Every person in his extended network served multiple functions. His childhood friend Marco, now a successful merchant in his own right, provided access to commercial information and served as a potential ally in business ventures. But Marco also served as Alessandro's introduction to other merchants, as a source of gossip about their mutual competitors, and as a gauge for how Alessandro's own reputation was perceived within their social circle. If Marco's loyalty ever wavered, Alessandro had three other friends who could serve similar functions, ensuring that no single relationship was critical to his success. This systematic redundancy characterized every aspect of Alessandro's reconstructed life. He maintained residences in 3 different districts of Florence, ensuring that political upheaval in any particular area would not leave him homeless. He diversified his income streams across multiple industries and geographic regions, so that economic downturns in any single sector could not devastate his finances. He cultivated skills in areas ranging from languages to weapons training to legal procedure, ensuring that changing circumstances would never find him completely unprepared. But the most sophisticated aspect of this architecture was Alessandro's information network. He had learned that knowledge was the most reliable form of protection, that understanding what others were planning before they acted provided opportunities to prevent threats or turn them to his advantage. He had systematically cultivated sources of information at every level of Florence's social hierarchy, from servants in powerful households to clerks in government offices to merchants who traveled regularly between cities. This network operated according to principles of mutual benefit rather than simple payment. Alessandro provided each source with information or services that they valued: introductions to useful contacts, warnings about potential problems, assistance with personal or professional challenges. In return, they shared intelligence about developments within their spheres of influence. The network was designed so that no single source was aware of its full extent, preventing any individual from using their knowledge of its operations against him. The information that flowed through this network allowed Alessandro to anticipate threats before they materialized and opportunities before they became obvious to competitors. When he learned that a particular noble family was facing financial difficulties, he could position himself to benefit from their eventual need to sell assets or seek loans. When he discovered that political tensions were rising between different factions, he could adjust his own relationships and investments to avoid being caught on the wrong side of a conflict. More importantly, this early warning system allowed him to identify potential threats to his own position and neutralize them before they could cause damage. When he learned that a competitor was spreading rumors about his business practices, he could investigate the source and either address their concerns directly or undermine their credibility through his own network. When he discovered that a political ally was considering a betrayal that would damage his interests, he could either provide incentives for loyalty or prepare alternative arrangements that would minimize the impact of their defection. This proactive approach to threat management represented a fundamental difference between the old Alessandro and his transformed successor. The weak self had reacted to problems after they arose, often when it was too late to prevent significant damage. The invulnerable self identified potential problems while they were still manageable and addressed them through carefully planned interventions that prevented escalation. The psychological dimensions of this architecture were equally sophisticated. Alessandro had recognized that his emotional responses could be weaponized against him, that enemies would attempt to provoke him into making mistakes by triggering anger, fear, or pride. He had therefore developed what he thought of as emotional armor, a set of practices and principles that prevented such manipulation from succeeding. This emotional discipline was built on a foundation of rigorous self-knowledge. Alessandro had spent considerable time analyzing his own psychological patterns, identifying the specific triggers that could cause him to act impulsively or irrationally. He had practiced responding to these triggers with predetermined strategies rather than automatic reactions, turning potential weaknesses into controlled responses that served his purposes. For example, he had recognized that criticism of his competence or integrity could provoke him to defensive responses that revealed more information than he intended to share. Instead of allowing such provocations to generate automatic reactions, he had developed a repertoire of responses that gathered intelligence about his critics' motivations while revealing nothing about his own plans or vulnerabilities. What appeared to others as natural conversation was actually a carefully orchestrated information-gathering process. This psychological sophistication extended to his understanding of others' motivations and vulnerabilities. Alessandro had learned to read the subtle signs that indicated when someone was lying, when they were under pressure from external sources, when they were considering betrayal or alliance. He studied people with the same systematic attention that he applied to market trends or political developments, understanding that human nature followed predictable patterns that could be anticipated and managed. This knowledge allowed him to construct interactions that served his purposes while appearing natural and spontaneous to others. When negotiating business deals, he could identify which arguments would be most persuasive to particular individuals, which concessions they would value most highly, which terms they would be most likely to violate. When building alliances, he understood what each potential ally needed most desperately and how to position himself as the person most capable of providing it. The social architecture that emerged from this understanding was remarkably sophisticated. Alessandro appeared to others as a genuinely pleasant and helpful individual, someone whose success had made him generous rather than grasping, whose intelligence manifested as practical wisdom rather than manipulative cunning. This reputation served his purposes perfectly, causing others to seek out his friendship and advice while lowering their guard against potential threats from his direction. Yet beneath this attractive surface lay a network of relationships and obligations that served his strategic objectives with mechanical precision. Every favor granted created an expectation of reciprocity. Every piece of advice offered established his expertise in a particular area. Every social connection facilitated access to information or resources that might prove valuable in future circumstances. The beauty of this system was its sustainability. Unlike crude manipulation, which created resentment and resistance when discovered, Alessandro's approach generated genuine value for everyone involved. People genuinely benefited from their relationships with him, received real value from his advice and assistance, and found their own objectives advanced through association with him. This mutual benefit ensured that his network remained stable and reliable even under pressure. As Alessandro's reputation and influence grew, he began to attract the attention of Florence's established power brokers. Some viewed him as a potential ally, recognizing that his growing wealth and expanding network could serve their purposes. Others saw him as a potential threat, understanding that his independence and capability made him difficult to control or predict. Both responses provided him with valuable intelligence about the established order's strengths and weaknesses. Those who sought his alliance revealed their own vulnerabilities through the terms they offered and the concessions they were willing to make. Alessandro could gauge the extent of their desperation, the pressure they were under from other sources, the resources they could bring to bear in support of mutual objectives. This information allowed him to negotiate from positions of strength even when his actual resources were inferior to theirs. Those who viewed him as a threat revealed different but equally valuable information about their defensive capabilities and likely responses to challenge. Their attempts to undermine or contain him showed him which tactics they considered most effective, which relationships they relied upon for support, which resources they were willing to commit to neutralizing potential competitors. This intelligence allowed him to anticipate their moves and prepare countermeasures before open conflict became necessary. The most sophisticated adversaries attempted to co-opt him through a combination of inducements and subtle threats, offering partnership while implying consequences for refusal. These interactions provided Alessandro with his most valuable intelligence, revealing not just immediate tactical considerations but the deeper strategic thinking of Florence's power elite. He learned which principles they would sacrifice for practical advantage, which relationships they considered expendable, which risks they were willing to accept in pursuit of their objectives. Through careful management of these interactions, Alessandro positioned himself as someone too valuable to destroy but too independent to control completely. He demonstrated his ability to serve the interests of various factions without becoming dependent on any single patron. He showed that attempts to pressure or manipulate him would be costly and uncertain in their success, while cooperation would be mutually beneficial and sustainable. This positioning required exceptional skill in managing perceptions and expectations. Alessandro had to appear strong enough to defend his interests but not so threatening as to provoke preemptive action against him. He had to demonstrate his value as an ally while maintaining his independence as a strategic actor. He had to show that he understood and respected the existing power structure while making clear that his cooperation was voluntary rather than coerced. The result was a position of what he thought of as strategic immunity. His growing network of relationships and obligations created a web of interests that would be damaged by any attack on his position. His diversified resources made him difficult to pressure through economic or political means. His information network provided early warning of any plans against him and intelligence about his would-be enemies' vulnerabilities. His reputation for reliability and competence made others reluctant to risk losing access to his capabilities. Most importantly, his systematic elimination of single points of failure meant that no particular threat could destroy what he had built. If one source of income disappeared, others remained. If one political ally betrayed him, alternatives were already cultivated. If one geographic region became hostile, he had prepared positions in others. If one strategy failed, he had developed contingency plans that could be implemented without delay. This invulnerability was not absolute. No human construction could eliminate all risk, but it was comprehensive enough to make him a dangerous enemy and a valuable ally. Those who opposed him found themselves fighting not just an individual but an entire system of relationships and resources that could adapt and respond to threats from multiple directions simultaneously. Those who allied with him gained access to capabilities and intelligence that enhanced their own positions substantially. The architecture Alessandro had constructed represented something new in Florence's political and economic landscape, a form of power that was not dependent on birth, institutional position, or the favor of particular patrons, but on systematic preparation and strategic thinking. He had proven that someone without traditional advantages could not only survive but thrive in a hostile environment by applying rigorous analysis and disciplined execution to every aspect of their existence. This demonstration had implications that extended far beyond Alessandro's personal success. It showed that the principles of invulnerability could be learned and applied by anyone willing to undertake the difficult work of systematic self-reconstruction. It proved that external circumstances, no matter how adverse, could be overcome by internal preparation and strategic sophistication. Most importantly, it revealed that true strength came not from the absence of vulnerability but from the systematic identification and elimination of each potential weakness. As Alessandro surveyed his transformed life from the vantage point of his reconstructed self, he understood that he had accomplished something unprecedented. He had made himself genuinely unstoppable through conventional means. Not because he was inherently superior to his adversaries, but because he had learned to think and prepare more systematically than they had. Not because he was immune to setbacks, but because he had constructed his life in such a way that setbacks could not permanently damage his position or permanently derail his objectives. The weak Alessandro had been vulnerable because he had been dependent on factors beyond his control: the goodwill of others, the stability of existing institutions, the continuation of favorable circumstances. The transformed Alessandro was unstoppable because he had made himself independent of such factors, capable of thriving regardless of external circumstances, prepared for any challenge that others might devise against him. This was the true meaning of invulnerability, not the absence of threats, but the systematic preparation that made all conventional threats manageable. Not the elimination of risk, but the construction of systems that could absorb and adapt to any disruption. Not the achievement of perfect safety, but the development of capabilities that made any attack too costly and uncertain for rational adversaries to attempt. Part 3, The Unstoppable Mind. The parchment beneath Niccolò Machiavelli's weathered hands bore the weight of revolutionary thought as he crafted the final elements of his philosophy in the quiet hours before dawn. Through his small window, Florence awakened to another day of commerce and conspiracy, its citizens unaware that the principles being articulated in this modest room would fundamentally alter humanity's understanding of strength, resilience, and the relationship between adversity and greatness. What Machiavelli was documenting was not merely a strategy for survival, but a complete transformation of human consciousness, the emergence of what he would come to recognize as the unstoppable mind. This final phase of development represented the synthesis of everything that had come before: the systematic destruction of the weak self, the construction of comprehensive invulnerability, and, now, the emergence of a form of consciousness that operated according to entirely different principles than those governing ordinary human experience. The unstoppable mind was not simply a stronger version of normal thinking, but a qualitatively different form of mental operation that had been forged in adversity's fire and tempered by the discipline of systematic self-reconstruction. Lorenzo de' Medici's return to Florence after years of exile provided Machiavelli with a perfect case study of this transformation in action. The man who had once been driven from the city by his enemies bore little resemblance to the ruler who had fled in panic and confusion. The intervening years of hardship and contemplation had burned away every trace of the comfortable assumptions that had made him vulnerable to his enemies' machinations. What returned was something unprecedented in the annals of political leadership: a mind that had become genuinely unstoppable through its systematic reconstruction. The first characteristic of the unstoppable mind was its complete independence from external validation or approval. The old Lorenzo had governed according to the expectations and traditions of his class, seeking the approval of other nobles, the admiration of the people, and the respect of foreign powers. These psychological dependencies had created multiple points of leverage that his enemies had exploited systematically. They had undermined his support among the nobility through whispered campaigns of character assassination, turned the people against him through economic manipulation, and isolated him diplomatically through carefully orchestrated pressure. The reconstructed Lorenzo operated according to entirely different principles. His decisions were based not on what others expected or desired, but on rigorous analysis of what would best serve his long-term objectives. He had learned to evaluate every choice according to its strategic merit rather than its political popularity, to pursue courses of action that would strengthen his position regardless of whether they generated immediate approval or criticism. This independence was not mere stubborn defiance, but the product of sophisticated analysis and careful preparation. Lorenzo had learned to distinguish between the appearance of support and its substance, to recognize the difference between temporary popularity and sustainable power. He understood that genuine strength came from creating conditions where others benefited from his success rather than from seeking their affection or approval through concessions that weakened his position. The psychological freedom that resulted from this independence was extraordinary. While his enemies continued to operate according to predictable patterns, seeking popularity, avoiding criticism, maintaining comfortable relationships with established interests, Lorenzo could pursue strategies that they literally could not conceive of attempting. His liberation from the need for external approval gave him access to a much broader range of tactical options than those available to leaders who remained psychologically dependent on others' opinions. This strategic advantage was compounded by the second characteristic of the unstoppable mind: its complete comfort with uncertainty and change. The comfortable self craved predictability and stability, investing enormous energy in maintaining familiar patterns and resisting disruption. This psychological need for certainty created vulnerability to any adversary who understood how to introduce chaos into previously stable systems. The weak mind could be paralyzed by unexpected challenges, overwhelmed by the need to process too many variables simultaneously, or manipulated through the deliberate introduction of uncertainty into areas where predictability had been assumed. The unstoppable mind operated according to opposite principles. It thrived in uncertain environments, recognizing that change created opportunities for those prepared to exploit them while disadvantaging those who clung to obsolete strategies. Instead of seeking to maintain stable conditions, it learned to anticipate and benefit from instability. Instead of being threatened by unexpected developments, it treated them as sources of competitive advantage. Lorenzo demonstrated this principle through his approach to Florence's volatile political environment. Rather than attempting to recreate the stable conditions that had existed before his exile, he embraced the city's factional divisions and used them to his advantage. He understood that political stability would benefit his enemies as much as himself, allowing them time to consolidate their positions and plan future attacks. Political instability, by contrast, rewarded those who could adapt quickly to changing circumstances while punishing those who remained committed to fixed strategies. This comfort with uncertainty extended to every aspect of strategic thinking. The unstoppable mind did not attempt to predict specific future events, recognizing such prediction as both impossible and unnecessary. Instead, it focused on developing the capabilities and positioning that would allow it to benefit from a wide range of possible futures. It prepared for multiple scenarios simultaneously, maintaining the flexibility to pivot between different approaches as circumstances evolved. The third characteristic of the unstoppable mind was its systematic integration of multiple time horizons in every decision. The weak mind operated primarily in the present, reacting to immediate pressures and opportunities without adequate consideration of their long-term implications. This temporal myopia created patterns of behavior that intelligent enemies could exploit, generating short-term crises that forced reactive decisions contrary to long-term interests. The unstoppable mind operated simultaneously across multiple time frames, evaluating every decision according to its immediate tactical value, its medium-term strategic implications, and its long-term impact on fundamental objectives. This temporal integration prevented adversaries from manipulating decision-making through the creation of artificial urgency or false deadlines. It also enabled the identification of opportunities that appeared unpromising in the short term but offered substantial advantages over longer periods. Lorenzo's reconstruction of his power base exemplified this integrated temporal thinking. His immediate tactical decisions were designed to neutralize specific threats and exploit particular opportunities. His medium-term strategy focused on building sustainable competitive advantages that would be difficult for enemies to counteract. His long-term vision centered on creating conditions where his continued success would benefit so many other parties that attacking him would become prohibitively expensive for any potential adversary. Each decision was evaluated according to all three temporal frameworks simultaneously. Actions that served immediate tactical needs but undermined strategic positioning were rejected. Strategies that offered medium-term advantages but conflicted with long-term objectives were modified or abandoned. Long-term visions that ignored immediate tactical realities were grounded in practical considerations that made their achievement possible. This temporal integration was supported by the fourth characteristic of the unstoppable mind, its systematic cultivation of what Machiavelli termed strategic patience. This was not passive endurance of adverse circumstances, but active preparation that used time as a strategic resource. The weak mind experienced delays and setbacks as pure frustrations, focusing on immediate relief rather than long-term positioning. The unstoppable mind treated every delay as an opportunity for additional preparation, every setback as intelligence about enemy capabilities and intentions. Strategic patience enabled the identification and exploitation of opportunities that were invisible to those operating with shorter time horizons. While enemies focused on immediate gratification or relief from immediate pressures, the patient strategist could accumulate advantages that would prove decisive when circumstances aligned favorably. While adversaries exhausted their resources in pursuit of quick victories, the patient mind conserved and positioned its capabilities for maximum effect when deployed. Lorenzo's approach to rebuilding his political alliances demonstrated this principle perfectly. Rather than attempting to recreate his previous network of support through immediate concessions or promises, he invested time in understanding how the political landscape had evolved during his absence. He studied the new power relationships that had emerged, the changed interests and priorities of various factions, the opportunities and vulnerabilities that had developed within existing alliances. This careful analysis revealed that attempting to restore the old order would be both impossible and suboptimal. The new configuration of interests and relationships created opportunities for constructing a more sustainable and advantageous position than he had previously enjoyed. By exercising strategic patience, he could position himself to benefit from developments that his enemies had set in motion for their own purposes, turning their apparent victories into the foundations of his eventual triumph. The fifth characteristic of the unstoppable mind was its systematic cultivation of what might be called productive paranoia, a heightened awareness of potential threats combined with practical preparation for their manifestation. This was distinct from neurotic anxiety or paralyzing fear, representing instead a disciplined form of threat assessment that enhanced rather than diminished operational effectiveness. The weak mind oscillated between complacency and panic, underestimating threats when circumstances were comfortable and overreacting when dangers materialized unexpectedly. This inconsistent threat assessment created vulnerabilities that enemies could exploit through the careful timing of their attacks. Strikes launched during periods of complacency found their targets unprepared, while threats introduced during periods of anxiety could provoke overreactions that served adversaries' purposes. The unstoppable mind maintained consistent vigilance regardless of immediate circumstances, treating every period of apparent security as preparation time for future challenges. It systematically analyzed potential threats not to generate anxiety, but to develop specific preparations that would minimize their impact when they materialized. This productive paranoia enhanced confidence rather than undermining it, creating the assurance that came from comprehensive preparation. Lorenzo's information network exemplified this principle in operation. He had learned during his exile that his previous downfall had resulted partly from inadequate intelligence about his enemy's activities. The comfortable version of himself had relied on official reports and formal diplomatic channels for information, missing the subtle signs that had preceded his opponent's coup. The reconstructed Lorenzo systematically cultivated sources of information at every level of society, from servants and rival households to merchants who traveled between hostile cities. This network operated according to the principle that threats were always developing somewhere within the system, and that early detection was the key to effective response. Rather than waiting for problems to become obvious, Lorenzo's intelligence apparatus identified potential dangers while they remained manageable. Rather than reacting to enemies' completed preparations, he could disrupt their plans while they were still forming or position himself to benefit from their eventual execution. The information gathered through this network served not only defensive purposes but offensive ones as well. Understanding his enemy's vulnerabilities and plans allowed Lorenzo to design interventions that turned their own strategies against them. Intelligence about their internal conflicts enabled him to exploit existing divisions rather than creating unnecessary opposition through direct confrontation. Knowledge of their resource constraints and timeline pressures allowed him to force decisions at moments when their options were most limited. The sixth characteristic of the unstoppable mind was its systematic integration of rational analysis with intuitive understanding. The weak mind tended to rely exclusively on one approach or the other, either pure logical analysis that missed crucial emotional and psychological factors, or pure intuitive judgment that ignored important empirical evidence. This intellectual limitation created blind spots that sophisticated enemies could exploit. The unstoppable mind had learned to synthesize both approaches, using rigorous analytical methods to process available information while remaining alert to patterns and possibilities that rational analysis might miss. This integration was not a compromise between different approaches but a genuine synthesis that enhanced the effectiveness of both. Rational analysis provided discipline and rigor that prevented wishful thinking or self-deception, while intuitive understanding provided access to insights that emerged from experience and pattern recognition rather than logical deduction. Lorenzo's approach to political alliance building demonstrated this synthesis in action. His rational analysis identified which potential allies possessed the resources, interests, and capabilities that would make them valuable partners. This analysis eliminated options that appeared attractive superficially but lacked substance, while highlighting possibilities that might be overlooked by less systematic evaluation. But rational analysis alone was insufficient for successful alliance building. Understanding which partnerships were theoretically viable was different from knowing how to construct and maintain them in practice. This required intuitive understanding of personality dynamics, emotional motivations, and the subtle psychological factors that determined whether theoretical compatibility would translate into practical cooperation. The synthesis of these approaches allowed Lorenzo to identify not just who he should ally with, but how to approach them, what they would find most compelling, and how to structure relationships that would remain stable under pressure. He could predict not just what people would do in their own rational interests, but how they would actually behave when those interests conflicted with emotional attachments, social pressures, or psychological needs. This integrated approach to understanding human behavior extended to his analysis of enemies as well. Lorenzo could predict his adversary's strategic choices through rational analysis of their interests and constraints, while simultaneously understanding the emotional and psychological factors that might cause them to deviate from purely rational behavior. This dual perspective made him extraordinarily difficult to surprise or outmaneuver, since he prepared for both the rational moves his enemies should make and the irrational ones they actually might make. The seventh characteristic of the unstoppable mind was its complete comfort with moral complexity and ethical ambiguity. The weak mind sought clear moral guidelines that could be applied mechanically to every situation, craving the psychological comfort that came from believing in simple distinctions between right and wrong, good and evil, just and unjust. This moral simplicity created vulnerabilities that could be exploited by enemies who understood that real-world situations rarely conformed to abstract moral categories. The unstoppable mind had moved beyond such moral simplicity without abandoning ethical consideration entirely. It understood that moral complexity was not moral relativism, that the absence of simple guidelines did not eliminate the need for ethical judgment. Instead of applying predetermined rules mechanically, it evaluated each situation according to its specific context, considering the full range of consequences that different choices might generate for all affected parties. This sophisticated moral reasoning enabled more effective action rather than paralyzing decision-making through endless ethical deliberation. By understanding the genuine ethical dimensions of complex situations, the unstoppable mind could identify courses of action that served both practical and moral objectives simultaneously. It could distinguish between necessary harsh measures and gratuitous cruelty, between strategic deception and malicious manipulation, between justified severity and unjustifiable abuse. Lorenzo's approach to dealing with former enemies illustrated this ethical sophistication. Simple moral reasoning might have suggested either complete forgiveness or systematic revenge as appropriate responses to those who had engineered his exile. Either approach would have been strategically suboptimal and ethically questionable. Complete forgiveness would have sent the message that betrayal carried no consequences, encouraging future disloyalty. Systematic revenge would have perpetuated cycles of conflict that would damage Florence while consuming resources better used for constructive purposes. Instead, Lorenzo developed nuanced responses calibrated to each individual's specific actions and circumstances. Those who had reluctantly supported his enemies under pressure were offered opportunities to demonstrate renewed loyalty through specific actions that served his interests. Those who had actively promoted his downfall faced consequences proportional to their roles and continued threat levels. Those who had profited from his absence were required to make restitution, but through means that strengthened his position rather than merely satisfying desires for vengeance. This approach served both practical and ethical objectives effectively. It re-established the principle that betrayal carried serious consequences while avoiding the creation of new grievances that would fuel future conflicts. It demonstrated his strength and resolve while showing that he could distinguish between different levels of responsibility and respond proportionally. It consolidated his return to power while beginning the process of reconciliation that would be necessary for long-term stability. The eighth and, perhaps most crucial characteristic of the unstoppable mind was its systematic cultivation of what Machiavelli termed philosophical immunity, a form of intellectual and emotional independence that made it impossible for others to manipulate through appeals to vanity, fear, anger, or other emotional vulnerabilities. This was not emotional numbness or indifference, but a sophisticated form of psychological discipline that prevented emotional responses from overriding strategic judgment. The weak mind remained vulnerable to emotional manipulation because it had not learned to distinguish between emotions as sources of information and emotions as imperatives for action. Fear provided valuable intelligence about potential threats, but it did not necessarily indicate that immediate flight was the optimal response. Anger revealed that someone had acted contrary to expectations, but it did not mean that immediate retaliation would serve long-term interests. Pride indicated recognition of achievements, but it did not justify reducing vigilance or preparation for future challenges. The unstoppable mind had learned to extract information from emotional responses while maintaining control over behavioral responses to that information. This emotional discipline was not achieved through suppression or denial, but through the development of conscious choice in the gap between emotional stimulus and behavioral response. Every emotion was experienced fully but evaluated rationally before determining what action, if any, it warranted. This philosophical immunity made Lorenzo extraordinarily difficult to manipulate through conventional means. His enemies could not provoke him into rash actions through insults or challenges to his honor. They could not paralyze him through fear or uncertainty about potential threats. They could not distract him from his objectives through appeals to vanity or offers of immediate gratification. They could not undermine his judgment through anger or resentment about past injuries. Instead, Lorenzo treated all such attempts at emotional manipulation as intelligence about his enemy's assessment of his psychological vulnerabilities and their own strategic limitations. Each failed attempt to provoke an irrational response revealed something about what his adversaries considered his weak points, information that he could use to adjust his presentation of himself and his intentions. Each emotional appeal revealed something about what his enemies thought he valued or feared, intelligence that was useful for understanding their own psychological profiles and likely approaches. This immunity was not absolute. No human construction could eliminate all emotional vulnerability, but it was comprehensive enough to frustrate most conventional attempts at psychological manipulation. Combined with his other capabilities, it made him genuinely unstoppable through ordinary means. His enemies could not defeat him through direct confrontation because he was too well prepared and positioned. They could not undermine him through political maneuvering because his network of relationships was too sophisticated and redundant. They could not manipulate him through psychological pressure because he had developed immunity to their most reliable tools of influence. The culmination of these characteristics was the emergence of what Machiavelli recognized as a new form of human consciousness, one that had transcended the limitations that constrained ordinary experience and achievement. The unstoppable mind was not simply a more effective version of normal thinking, but a qualitatively different form of mental operation that had been forged through systematic adversity and disciplined self-reconstruction. This transformation was irreversible and contagious. Those who achieved it could not return to their previous state of comfortable vulnerability, having crossed a threshold beyond which the old patterns of thought and behavior were no longer possible. But they also served as examples for others who recognized the possibility of similar transformation in their own lives. The unstoppable mind became a beacon that illuminated possibilities for human development that had previously been invisible or unimaginable. As Machiavelli observed these principles in operation throughout Florence's complex political and commercial environment, he began to understand that he was documenting not just a philosophy of personal development, but a new stage in human evolution. The comfortable mind represented humanity as it had developed under favorable conditions, adapted to environments where cooperation was rewarded and aggression was controlled by external institutions. The unstoppable mind represented humanity as it could become under pressure, adapted to environments where individual strength and strategic sophistication determined outcomes. The question that emerged from this observation was whether this evolution was limited to those who experienced severe adversity directly, or whether it could be achieved through conscious choice and systematic preparation. Could someone develop the characteristics of the unstoppable mind proactively, or did they require the harsh instruction of personal defeat and reconstruction? The answer would determine whether these insights represented merely an interesting analysis of exceptional individuals or a practical method for human development that could be applied more broadly. The evidence suggested that while extreme adversity provided the most reliable path to this transformation, the principles themselves could be learned and applied by anyone willing to undertake the difficult work of systematic self-examination and reconstruction. The key was recognizing that the comfortable self, regardless of how successful it might appear by conventional standards, remained fundamentally vulnerable to disruption by forces beyond its control. Only by voluntarily destroying this comfortable self and rebuilding according to more rigorous principles could someone achieve genuine invulnerability. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others because he has already done to himself what his enemies would attempt to do to him. He has already identified and eliminated every point of vulnerability that they might exploit. He has already experienced the worst that fortune can deliver and emerged stronger from the encounter. He has already died to everything that made him weak and been reborn as something that cannot be conquered through conventional means. This was the ultimate insight of Machiavellian philosophy, that true strength comes not from the absence of adversity but from its systematic embrace, not from the avoidance of vulnerability but from its deliberate elimination, not from the hope that favorable circumstances will continue but from the certainty that they will not and the preparation that makes their cessation irrelevant. The unstoppable mind represents humanity's response to the recognition that the world is fundamentally uncertain, that security based on external circumstances is ultimately illusory, and that genuine strength must therefore be constructed from within according to principles that remain valid regardless of changing conditions. It is the mind that has learned to thrive in chaos, to find opportunity in crisis, to extract strength from suffering, and to transform every adversity into an element of its own invulnerability. In the quiet hours before dawn, as Machiavelli completed his analysis of these principles, he understood that he had documented something unprecedented, a systematic method for human transformation that could turn anyone, regardless of their starting circumstances, into someone genuinely unstoppable by conventional means. The philosophy was complete, its principles tested through observation and experience, its implications revolutionary for anyone willing to undertake the difficult work of destroying their weak self and constructing something infinitely more powerful in its place. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others, because he has become something that transcends the vulnerabilities that make destruction possible. He has become unstoppable not because he cannot be harmed, but because harm cannot eliminate what he has made himself into. He has achieved the only form of invulnerability that is actually possible in an uncertain world, the invulnerability that comes from being prepared for everything and dependent on nothing except the principles that have made him strong. This is the final gift of adversity, the opportunity to discover what we might become when everything we thought we were has been stripped away, and what remains is something infinitely more powerful than what was lost. The man who accepts this gift and does the work it requires becomes something new in the world, not just another person who has survived difficult circumstances, but someone who has been fundamentally transformed by them into something that cannot be conquered, manipulated, or destroyed by any external force.